There's no doubt that we all experience seasons of confusion and chaos and question about what really is going on, and are there any answers to the situation I may be experiencing, whether it's a health scare, a financial situation, a job loss, a relationship struggle, or even a pandemic. And we wonder, where is God in the midst of this? What is God really doing? And it was in that vein, in that question that we all felt in the midst of the circumstances of life that we all experienced, that we thought it would be good to pause. And throughout the scripture, what we find is in those moments of the deepest stress, in the moments of the deepest, darkest times, people take a moment to reflect on who God is. And one of the ways that we do that is through a song. And if you were to study the Bible, you'll see over and over again this idea of bringing God a new song that is a new reflection of how we view Him and whatever it is that we're facing, how we see Him afresh and anew. So I went to Ernesto and I said, Ernesto, I really believe God is calling us to write a song in this season. And I believe that song really needs to be something uplifting and also a reminder of who God is. And I had this idea of God always being there.
Pastor Dave gave me this phone call asking to write this song. We were probably 2 weeks away from going back to live services, meeting together as a church, because at that point we had all been in quarantine and had been recording our services to be able to provide online to kind of get us through this season. And so we had to have a very quick turnaround. So in something like 2 weeks, we had to be able to fully produce this song. So at that point, I called up my good friend David Amezaga, and he was able to piece together these incredible musicians to be able to pull this off. And man, by the end of it, we were just in awe. We could not believe that our church had been able to pull something like this off.
Launched into writing, and that went back and forth. Ernesto, who is a genius when it comes to music and writing and with words and literature. He's very good with putting words together poetically. And so with this concept of sustainer was birthed as we began to talk about this concept, and Ernesto began to write, and then he would throw it back to me, and we would talk about God's sovereignty, God's providence. What can we point people to in the midst of this season? And so we went back and forth, and at the end, Ernesto, in great genius form, put together this poetic expression of who God is and how we can worship Him as our sustainer.
So the video was an interesting concept. We wanted to make it accessible, and we wanted people to see themselves in that story. And so we were trying to think through, coronavirus, COVID time, we want this to be a story people see themselves in, but even 10 years from now, when hopefully this is not a thing anymore, what is a way that we can capture the feeling of wanting to get through something and maybe tell it from the angle of a story that's not a common story? We're like, what would it be like to try to follow the story of a man who's been laid off and is trying to see God at work? So that way when the viewers watching the video, they might think of their own lives and think, well, you know what? Now that I see this, maybe God's been at work in the way that somebody texted me today, or in the way that somebody approached me today, or just something that I read that was perfectly on time. Maybe it's not these big miraculous kind of moments with God, but maybe it's just in the little everyday things that we see God at work. And more than wanting to see Him work in miraculous ways, maybe there's an angle of God that we can learn from Him being a sustainer, somebody who gets us through and walks through with us. And so the music video ended up being just such a great story. And ultimately, our team did such a great job in capturing that story in beautiful ways. And all throughout, we had all these God moments, just things that came together so perfectly. And we shot it in 3 days. I don't know how we pulled that off. But man, what a rewarding experience. If you are a person who is walking through something that feels like a long-term struggle or a long-term challenge, that it just doesn't seem like God is coming through in the way you would hope, or maybe in the timeline that you would hope, I just hope that Sustainer would be the kind of anthem for you that reminds you that God is with you, and that ultimately, no matter what you're facing, we serve a God who is intimately involved in the details of our lives. And if he was there at the beginning when the world was in darkness and it was formless, and he was hovering over that and was able to give it order and was able to make it fruitful, surely he can take people like you and I who he loves and hover over the darkness in our own lives and be able to be God, the God who sustains, the God who makes sense of it all. And so I just hope that as you're listening to Sustainer, that you're encouraged, that you feel reminded of the God that you serve, and that you're not alone, and that God is sustaining you. Certainly in a time like what we're going through with this coronavirus, this is applicable, but man, all throughout our lives, we find ourselves in these kinds of moments. I pray that you are reminded that God is your sustainer,